The avoidant person completely underestimated you, fundamentally misread your strength and your capacity, mistook your patience for weakness, your understanding for dependency, your investment in the relationship for inability to walk away, and this catastrophic miscalculation is now confronting them with reality that destroys every assumption they made about who held power in the dynamic and about what you were capable of doing when you decided you'd had enough. Throughout the relationship, the avoidant operated with specific beliefs about you that made them feel safe and in control. They believed you needed them more than they needed you, that your emotional investment made you dependent and manageable, that your patience with their patterns meant you'd tolerate anything indefinitely, that your understanding of their wounds meant you'd never actually enforce consequences, that your love for them meant you'd always be available if they decided they wanted to return. These beliefs gave them enormous sense of power and safety because they thought they could withdraw and return at will, could treat you inconsistently without losing you, could take you for granted because you cared too much to leave. They saw your emotional availability as vulnerability rather than as strength. They interpreted your willingness to work through difficulties as inability to set boundaries rather than as conscious choice to invest. They confused your capacity to love someone with their limitations with desperate neediness rather than recognizing it as profound strength and generosity. This fundamental misreading of who you are and what you're capable of created false sense of security where they believed they held all the cards, they had all the options, they could manage the relationship on their terms without fear of genuine loss. But then something shifted that revealed the truth they'd been blind to. You have power they never recognized, strength they completely underestimated, capacity to walk away that they never believed you possessed. Perhaps you stopped pursuing them and disappeared completely. Perhaps you enforced boundaries with finality that shocked them. Perhaps you moved on visibly and publicly in ways that proved you weren't suffering or waiting. Perhaps you demonstrated through your choices in your life that you not only didn't need them, but were actually better off without them. Whatever the specific trigger, they're now confronting devastating reality that you were never the weaker party, never the more dependent one, never the person who would tolerate anything to maintain connection. You were a powerful person making conscious choice to invest in them, and when that choice was withdrawn, when your power was directed away from them rather than toward maintaining relationship with them, they discovered they'd completely misjudged the balance of power, and they'd lost someone far stronger and far more capable than they ever understood. The power they didn't see while you were accommodating their patterns. The avoidant person's fundamental miscalculation was failing to recognize that your accommodation of their patterns, your patience with their withdrawal, your understanding of their wounds was not evidence of weakness or dependency, but was evidence of tremendous strength and conscious choice that could be withdrawn at any moment. Understanding the power they didn't see while you were being patient reveals both their blindness and the magnitude of their error in taking you for granted. They didn't see that your patience with their patterns required enormous emotional strength and self-regulation that most people don't possess. When the avoidant withdrew, when they were hot and cold, when they created uncertainty and instability, you remained relatively calm and patient. You gave them space when they needed it. You tried to understand their behavior rather than immediately reacting with anger or with giving up. This patience looked to them like passivity or like acceptance born from having no other options. But patience with difficult behavior is not passive weakness, it's active strength. It requires regulating your own anxiety and hurt. It requires consciously choosing understanding over reaction. It requires emotional maturity to separate someone's patterns from their worth, to see their wounds driving their behavior rather than just experiencing the impact of that behavior. The avoidant mistook this sophisticated emotional regulation for simple tolerance, born from neediness, never recognizing that maintaining patience requires power, and that this power could at any point be redirected from patience to boundaries. They didn't see that your emotional availability and your willingness to be vulnerable was courage rather than dependency, strength rather than weakness. You shared your feelings openly. You expressed your needs. You were willing to be vulnerable about how their behavior affected you. To the avoidant, this openness looked like emotional instability or neediness, because their defensive system interprets emotional expression as weakness. But emotional availability is actually profound strength. It requires courage to be vulnerable, to show your feelings, to express needs, knowing they might not be met. It requires confidence in your own worth, to share your authentic experience rather than hiding behind defenses. It requires emotional intelligence to name your feelings and communicate them clearly. The avoidant, who cannot be emotionally available because it feels too dangerous, mistook your courage for weakness, never understanding that you were demonstrating capacity they lack, and that this capacity comes from strength, not from dependency. They didn't see that your investment in the relationship and your willingness to work through difficulties was choice based on your values and your capacity for commitment, rather than desperate attempt to hold on to them because you had no other options. You worked to understand their patterns. You tried to communicate effectively. You gave multiple chances. You invested emotional energy in trying to make the relationship work. The avoidant interpreted this investment as evidence that you needed them desperately, that you were clinging to the relationship because you couldn't imagine being without them, that you were more invested because you had fewer options or lower worth. But investment in relationship is not sign of desperation. It's sign of integrity and commitment capacity. You invested because you value commitment, because you believe in working through difficulties when the connection is meaningful, because you have capacity to prioritize relationship alongside your individual needs. This investment came from strength and values, not from weakness and lack of options, but the avoidant couldn't recognize this distinction. They didn't see that your understanding of their wounds and your compassion for their struggles came from your own emotional depth and intelligence, rather than from inability to set boundaries. You recognized their patterns as defensive responses to childhood wounds. You had compassion for their struggles, even when those struggles hurt you. You tried to create safety for their vulnerability, even when they couldn't reciprocate. The avoidant interpreted this understanding as permission to continue their patterns, as evidence that you'd never actually enforce consequences because you were too understanding to walk away. But understanding someone's wounds doesn't require accepting ongoing harm from those wounds. Compassion for someone's struggles doesn't obligate you to sacrifice your well-being indefinitely. Your understanding came from emotional sophistication that allowed you to see their humanity and their pain, while also being capable of recognizing when compassion must coexist with boundaries. They mistook your sophisticated understanding for inability to protect yourself. They didn't see that your self-worth was intact throughout the relationship, that you were choosing to love them rather than needing them to validate your worth. The avoidant assumed that your patience and investment meant you derived your sense of worth from their validation, that you needed the relationship to feel valuable, that you were dependent on them for your self-esteem, but you maintained your own worth throughout. You had your own life, your own goals, your own sources of meaning and validation beyond the relationship. You chose to invest in them from a place of wholeness rather than from a place of emptiness seeking to be filled. You loved them as addition to your life rather than as completion of incomplete self. This self-worth that existed independent of them was invisible to them because they confused your choice to invest with desperate need to be chosen, never recognizing that people with genuine self-worth can choose to love imperfect people without that choice meaning they lack other options or internal validation. They didn't see that you were capable of making hard decisions and enforcing firm boundaries when necessary, that your patience had limits and your understanding had boundaries. Throughout the relationship, you were patient and understanding, and the avoidant interpreted this as your natural state, as your only capacity, as evidence that you couldn't or wouldn't ever become firm and decisive. They believed you'd always give one more chance, always try to understand one more time, always accept them back if they returned. They didn't recognize that your patience was choice, that could end, that your understanding existed within framework of boundaries that could be enforced, that you had full capacity to make hard decision to walk away and to maintain that decision with finality. When you finally enforced boundaries, when you made hard decision to leave or to make yourself unavailable, they were shocked because they'd convinced themselves you couldn't do this, that this level of firmness and self-protection was beyond your capacity. They didn't see that your love for them was strong enough to survive the ending, that you could love them and still choose to leave, that caring about someone doesn't obligate you to remain in situation that harms you. The avoidant assumed that if you truly loved them, you'd stay regardless of how they treated you. That love meant accepting anything to maintain connection. When you left, despite loving them, when you demonstrated that love and boundaries can coexist, when you showed that caring about someone doesn't mean sacrificing yourself for them, it revealed dimension of strength they hadn't anticipated. Loving someone enough to want their healing and happiness, while also loving yourself enough to leave when the relationship damages you, requires tremendous power and emotional maturity. The avoidant didn't know you possessed this capacity until you demonstrated it by walking away from someone you loved because staying was hurting you. How your departure revealed strength that shattered their assumptions. The moment you left, the moment you enforced firm boundaries and made yourself unavailable, the avoidant was confronted with undeniable evidence that every assumption they'd made about you was wrong, that they'd fundamentally misunderstood who held power and who was more capable of surviving without the relationship. Understanding how your departure revealed your power illuminates both the shock they experienced and the permanence of their new understanding of who you actually are. Your departure revealed your power by demonstrating that you could walk away from someone you loved when staying was damaging you, proving you prioritize your well-being over attachment to a specific person. The avoidant assumed your love for them meant you couldn't leave, that your emotional investment would keep you tethered regardless of how they treated you. But you proved that your love, while real, was not chains that bound you to harmful situation. You could love them and still choose yourself. You could care about them deeply and still recognize that the relationship wasn't serving your well-being. You could want things to work while accepting that they weren't working and making decision to prioritize your healing over your attachment. This demonstration that love and boundaries coexist, that you're capable of leaving people you care about when necessary for your well-being, revealed level of strength and self-love the avoidant didn't know you possessed. Your departure revealed your power by showing you could make firm decision and maintain it without wavering, despite their attempts to restore connection. The avoidant expected that even if you did leave, you'd be susceptible to their reach-outs, you'd respond to their apologies or their expressions of missing you. You'd give them another chance if they showed minimal effort. But you didn't. You made decision and you stood by it. You didn't respond to their messages. You didn't allow their emotional appeals to sway you. You didn't give in when they expressed regret or when they tried to restore connection. This firmness, this ability to make decision and maintain it regardless of emotional difficulty or external pressure, demonstrated strength of will and clarity of purpose they hadn't recognized you possessed. They discovered you weren't someone who could be talked out of your decisions or manipulated back into situation you'd consciously chosen to leave. Your departure revealed your power by demonstrating you could survive and thrive without them, disproving their assumption that you needed them for your happiness or completeness. The avoidant believed on some level that you needed them, that losing them would devastate you, that you'd struggle without them in your life. But your departure was followed not by collapse, but by visible thriving. You were happy. You were successful. You were clearly moving forward with your life. You were not just surviving their absence, but were flourishing in it. This thriving proved you were never dependent on them for your well-being, that you were complete without them, that you had always been choosing them from place of wholeness, rather than choosing them from place of need. The recognition that you don't need them, that you're actually better without them, shattered their assumption that they held power through being necessary to your happiness. Your departure revealed your power by showing you could enforce consequences without lengthy explanation or emotional drama, demonstrating control and composure they didn't expect. When you left, you didn't engage in long arguments about everything they did wrong. You didn't try to make them understand all the ways they hurt you. You didn't have dramatic emotional confrontation. You simply communicated your decision, and you acted on it. You left with dignity, with composure, with control of your emotions and your choices. This calm execution of firm boundary, this ability to act decisively without needing to justify or explain extensively, revealed sophistication and power they hadn't anticipated. They expected that if you did leave, it would be messy, emotional, dramatic, in ways that would give them something to work with or something to dismiss. But your composed departure gave them nothing to dismiss and demonstrated level of self-possession they didn't know you had. Your departure revealed your power by demonstrating you could cut them off completely and genuinely move on emotionally, rather than remaining stuck, wanting them, or hoping for their return. The avoidant assumed that even if physical connection ended, you'd remain emotionally attached, still wanting them, still hoping they'd come back or change. But you didn't. You genuinely moved on. You released the attachment. You stopped organizing your emotional life around them. You became genuinely indifferent, where they expected ongoing longing. This complete emotional disengagement proved you have capacity to process loss, to release attachment, to redirect your emotional energy towards your own life rather than remaining stuck in past. The avoidant discovered you weren't someone who would pine for them indefinitely, but were someone capable of genuine closure and forward movement. Your departure revealed your power by forcing them to confront that they'd lost something valuable through their own choices, that the power dynamic was not what they believed it to be. When you left and stayed gone, when you thrived without them, when you demonstrated complete disinterest in reconciliation, the avoidant had to confront painful reality. They were not the prize in the relationship. They were not the one with more options or more power. They were not doing you favor by being with you. Instead, you were the valuable one. You were the one with genuine strength and capacity. You were the one making conscious choice to invest in them that they took for granted and that they've now permanently lost. This reversal of their understanding of the power dynamic was devastating because it meant they destroyed relationship where they were actually the fortunate one, where they had access to someone more capable and more powerful than they recognized. Your departure revealed your power by demonstrating that your previous accommodation of their patterns was choice that could be revoked rather than permanent state they could rely on indefinitely. The avoidant believed your patience and understanding were fixed traits, that you'd always be understanding and available regardless of how they behaved. But your departure proved this was never who you fundamentally were. It was how you chose to show up in context of relationship you valued. When the relationship no longer served you, when their patterns exceeded your boundaries, you revoked the accommodation. You stopped being patient. You stopped being understanding. You stopped making space for their dysfunction. This revelation that what they experienced as your nature was actually your choice, and that this choice could be withdrawn, meant they'd lost not just your presence, but your willingness to create safety and space for their patterns, gifts they cannot easily find elsewhere. The specific displays of power that forced their recognition, the avoidance recognition that you're far more powerful than they understood, came through specific demonstrations of your strength and capacity that were undeniable and that couldn't be rationalized away through their usual defensive interpretations. Understanding these specific displays reveals what created their shocked recognition and what continues to affect them as they process their miscalculation. You displayed power through your immediate implementation of complete no contact without negotiation or gradual transition, cutting them off entirely from access to you. The moment you decided you were done, you blocked them everywhere. You stopped responding. You made yourself completely unavailable. There was no gradual fade, no maintaining friendship, no leaving door open for future possibility. The totality and the immediacy of your withdrawal demonstrated decisiveness and strength of conviction the avoidant didn't expect. They thought if you did leave, it would be process they could influence, decision you might reconsider. But you cut them off so completely and so immediately that they had no opportunity to talk you out of it or to negotiate different terms. This display of power in swift, complete action revealed you were far more decisive and far more capable of firm boundaries than they'd believed. You displayed power through your visible thriving that made clear you were not just surviving, but were genuinely happy and successful without them. They saw or heard about your achievements, your happiness, your full life through social media or through mutual friends. You were glowing. You were engaged with life. You were clearly better off. This wasn't performance for their benefit. It was genuine happiness that radiated from you in ways that couldn't be faked. This display of thriving revealed you had power to create happiness independent of them, that you didn't need them for your fulfillment, that losing them freed you rather than diminishing you. The contrast between how they expected you to be, suffering and struggling, and how you actually were, thriving and happy, forced recognition that you were far more resilient and self-sufficient than they'd understood. You displayed power through your complete emotional indifference when circumstances forced interaction, treating them like stranger rather than like someone who once mattered deeply to you. If you encountered them, if you had to be in same space, you were polite but emotionally flat. You weren't warm, you weren't cold, you simply didn't seem to care. Your indifference was obvious, and it was genuine. You weren't performing lack of caring. You genuinely didn't care anymore. This display of emotional power, this capacity to go from loving them deeply to being genuinely indifferent, revealed emotional range and capacity for detachment they didn't know you possessed. They expected you'd always care, always be affected by them. Discovering you'd moved to a place where they simply didn't matter to you. Emotionally, forced recognition that you were never as attached or dependent as they believed. You displayed power through your refusal to provide closure or to engage with their attempts to apologize or make amends, denying them the relief they sought. When they tried to reach out, when they wanted to talk or to apologize, you didn't give them the conversation. You didn't provide the closure. You left them sitting with their discomfort without opportunity to ease it through apology or explanation. This refusal to engage demonstrated you didn't need their closure, and you weren't interested in making them feel better about what they'd done. You were powerful enough to live with open endings, to not need resolution with them, to prioritize protecting yourself over giving them comfort. This strength to withhold what they wanted without guilt or second guessing revealed level of self-protection and boundary maintenance they hadn't anticipated. You displayed power through your dating or openness to dating that proved you weren't waiting for them and weren't stuck on them as only option. They saw or heard you were with someone new or were dating. This demonstrated you were available to others while being unavailable to them, that you'd moved on romantically, that you weren't holding on to hope they'd return or change. This display of power through moving forward romantically forced recognition that you weren't their backup option, you weren't waiting around, you were genuinely building new life that included possibility of new partnership. The jealousy this created was mixed with shocked recognition that you were more desirable and more capable of attracting healthy partners than they'd given you credit for. You displayed power through your raised standards that made clear you wouldn't accept treatment they provided, that you'd leveled up in ways that left them behind, in how you talked about relationships if asked, in who you chose to spend time with, in the boundaries you obviously maintained. It became clear you'd learned from the relationship and had raised your standards substantially. You weren't accepting inconsistency anymore. You weren't tolerating emotional unavailability. You weren't making space for people's patterns at expense of your well-being. This display of power through elevated standards forced recognition that even if they wanted to reconcile, they no longer meet your standards, that you've grown beyond them in ways that make them inadequate for what you now require. You displayed power through your focus on yourself and your own life rather than on them or the relationship, demonstrating you genuinely redirected your considerable energy toward yourself. You were pursuing goals with renewed energy. You were investing in friendships and community. You were focused on your growth and your future. This wasn't distraction from pain. It was genuine engagement with your life, independent of them. This display of power through authentic self-focus revealed you had always had tremendous energy and capacity, but you'd been directing it toward the relationship and toward understanding them. When you redirected that energy toward yourself, the results were obviously powerful, making them recognize they'd benefited from your considerable strength and focus, and that losing you meant losing someone whose energy and capacity elevated whatever they were directed toward. You displayed power through your dignity and composure in all interactions, never giving them satisfaction of seeing you broken or desperate. Every interaction they had with you or heard about revealed someone composed, strong, confident. You weren't begging them to come back. You weren't bad-mouthing them to others. You weren't showing signs of being devastated. You maintained dignity that communicated you were in control of yourself and your choices. This consistent display of dignity and strength forced recognition that you were never the weak or dependent person they imagined, but were always a strong person, choosing to be vulnerable with them, and that when you stopped choosing vulnerability with them, the strength that was always there became undeniable. Why your power threatens and attracts them simultaneously. The avoidance recognition of your power creates complex psychological response where they're simultaneously threatened by your strength and attracted to it more intensely than they were when they believed you were weaker. Understanding this dual reaction reveals both their psychology and why their increased attraction to you now doesn't mean reconciliation would work or would be healthy for you. Your power threatens the avoidant because it means they no longer control the dynamic or have power to determine the relationship's terms. Throughout the relationship, they felt safe because they believed they held power. They could withdraw, and you'd be there when they returned. They could control the distance. They could determine the level of commitment. But your demonstration of power reversed this completely. You control whether they have access. You determine whether reconciliation is possible. You hold all the cards now. This loss of control is deeply threatening to the avoidant's psychological safety because control is how they manage their vulnerability and their fear of abandonment. When you hold the power, when you're the one who decides their invulnerable position they've spent their life avoiding, And this vulnerability is terrifying, even as part of them recognizes it's what they need to experience. Your power threatens the avoidant because it proves they were wrong about you in ways that force them to question their judgment and their ability to accurately assess people and situations. They pride themselves on being perceptive, on understanding people and dynamics, but they completely misread you. They thought you were weak and you're strong. They thought you needed them and you don't. They thought they could take you for granted and they couldn't. This recognition that they were so fundamentally wrong threatens their confidence in their own assessment abilities and makes them question what else they might be wrong about. If they misjudged you this badly, how reliable is their judgment about anything else? This threat to their self-confidence and their belief in their own perceptiveness is uncomfortable and destabilizing. Your power threatens the avoidant because it challenges their defensive narrative that they're an independent person who doesn't need anyone. If you don't need them, if you're thriving without them, it should prove their belief that independence is sustainable and desirable. But instead, your demonstration of genuine independence and strength highlights the falseness of their own defended independence. You're genuinely independent. You're complete without them. You create your own happiness. You don't need anyone for your wholeness. Their independence is defensive. It's reaction to fear rather than genuine self-sufficiency. It leaves them lonely rather than fulfilled. It's compensation for inability to sustain intimacy rather than authentic preference. Your real independence makes their fake independence obvious by contrast, threatening the narrative they've used to justify their patterns. Your power attracts the avoidant because strength and independence are qualities they value and are drawn to, qualities they couldn't recognize in you when you were being patient and accommodating. The avoidant is typically attracted to strong, independent people because these qualities feel safer than neediness or dependency. But they couldn't see your strength when you were demonstrating it through patience and understanding because these look like weakness to them. Now that your strength is displayed through boundaries and thriving, through qualities they recognize as strength, they're experiencing intense attraction. You're displaying exactly what they're attracted to: independence, strength, ability to be happy without them, and this creates powerful pull, even though it's the same person, the same strength that was always there, just displayed differently. Your power attracts the avoidant because scarcity and unavailability make you more desirable than you were when you were available and accommodating. The avoidant devalues what's available and desires what's scarce or unavailable. When you were patient and understanding and making yourself available to work through their patterns, they devalued these qualities and took you for granted. But now you're scarce, you're unavailable, you're not interested in reconciliation, you've moved on. This scarcity creates intense desire through psychological principle that things become more valuable when they're hard to obtain. Your power is inextricable from your unavailability, and this unavailability makes you more desirable to their psychological system than you've ever been. Your power attracts the avoidant because it proves you're rare and valuable in ways they didn't appreciate when they had you. The strength you've demonstrated, the ability to walk away from someone you love, to thrive independently, to maintain firm boundaries, to genuinely move on, is rare. Most people can't do this. The avoidant is recognizing they had someone exceptional who they took for granted because they misread your strength as weakness. This recognition of your rarity creates attraction because the avoidant understands they lost someone they're unlikely to find again, someone whose strength and capacity make them more valuable than anyone else they're likely to encounter. Your power attracts the avoidant because it represents challenge and because conquering or winning someone powerful would validate them in ways that having someone they perceived as weak never could. If you were weak and dependent as they believed, having you validated nothing about their desirability or worth. But if you're strong and independent, and you chose to be with them, that would validate their worth significantly. Now that they recognize your strength, getting you back becomes challenge that their ego wants to win. Having powerful person choose them would prove something about their value that having dependent person choose them never proved. This attraction is fundamentally about their ego and their need for validation, rather than about genuine appreciation of you, but it creates intense desire nonetheless. Your power attracts the avoidant because it creates mystery and unpredictability that makes you interesting in ways you weren't when they believed they understood and could predict you. When they thought you were weak and dependent, you were known quantity, boring, predictable, controllable. But your demonstration of unexpected strength makes you mysterious. They didn't know you were capable of this. They don't know what else you might be capable of. They cannot predict your moves or anticipate your responses. This mystery and unpredictability creates intrigue and attraction because the avoidant is more engaged by what they don't understand than by what they think they've figured out. Your power has made you unknown to them again, and this unknown quality is attractive. The simultaneous threat and attraction your power creates leaves the avoidant in an uncomfortable position where they want you intensely, but are also frightened by what wanting you would require. They're attracted to your strength, but threatened by the vulnerability that pursuing you would create. They want to win you back, but are scared of the power you hold. They desire you more than ever, but recognize they don't meet your standards. This internal conflict between desire and threat is torture for them, but this discomfort is not your responsibility to resolve and shouldn't influence your choices about maintaining your boundaries and your unavailability. Their recognition of your power is their problem to sit with, their lesson to learn from, their motivation to potentially grow, or their ongoing source of regret that they carry for having lost someone far more powerful than they ever understood while they had the chance to appreciate them.